I'm Dana Shagru with CE Ag World Greenhouse Produce, an innovative brand that engages with the rapidly expanding global greenhouse produce industry through a variety of platforms. Our mission is to educate and connect greenhouse produce growers and industry allies to help them better understand and sustainably advance the global food industry. On this episode of CE Ag Talks, I'll be speaking with Rose Labbe, research scientist at the Harrow RDC, a greenhouse, CEA, and field crop research complex in Ontario. Rose, welcome to CE Ag Talks.
Thank you so much, Dana. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we'll be talking about pest management and vertical farming environments. So, to begin, can you explain why growers are less likely to find pests in vertical farms?
Yeah. So again, I come from a greenhouse background. So I think if we were to contrast those two environments, the controlled environment, agricultural area, and greenhouses, some of the major differences is obviously the first one that comes to mind is the ability to exclude pests in the first place. So with the vertical agriculture, oftentimes you don't have those conduits, the great big doors that lead into the cropping system. So there's really a lot more opportunities for exclusion. There's an ability to restrict pests by, using air curtains that prevent them from blowing in or flying in. And there's also kind of there's a pretty considerable ability to mitigate things like, the environment in general. So temperature, relative humidity, and even the lighting conditions. And all of this can help, you can really tailor them so that you can help prevent pest outbreaks or tailor them to, the establishment of beneficial arthropods. We know, for instance, spider mites love a really low relative humidity and a high temperature. And again, so if you keep that in mind, you can adjust your conditions to prevent them from establishing in the first place. And of course, the restricted entry offers that high degree of control. So again, having smaller entryways and preventing, if there's more automation involved, you don't need to have people coming in and out all the time. And along with them, the probability of introducing a pest. And so automation, again, restricted entry, those are I would say, the main reasons for why we see fewer pests in general in vertical farms.
Yeah, it sounds like the more control over your environment, the better when it comes to pest management, for sure.
Yeah.
So I know this is usually depends on the crop, but what kinds of pests can you typically find in vertical farms?
Yeah, so for vertical farms, I would say the ones that are most likely to show up and the ones that we've seen so far tend to be these really tiny microscopic insects that, when you bring in your plants, if you are bringing them in from another facility, for instance, they would have life stages that are just so hard to see immediately to the naked eye. And so they go unnoticed because normally, at a field crop, everything is coming in and there's no way to exclude. And so even big things get through. But for vertical farms, the big challenge is the sneaky little life stages that get through the eggs, the pupae that are in the growing substrate, if there is one. It could, eggs of insects are just, they could be so microscopic you wouldn't even see them, or they could be even embedded in the leaves. So the kinds of pests that you would see are things like thrips. Again, those eggs are embedded right in the leaves, so you would have a lot of trouble seeing them right away. Shore flies, moth flies, fungus gnats, they come in growing substrate. So they establish brilliantly well in very humid environments and without you even noticing them. Then you've got things like two-spotted spider mites, again, microscopic at all life stages. But again, once you see them, it's hard to unsee them. They really can take over in a short period of time. And then things like whitefly, sweet potato whitefly, greenhouse whitefly that we obviously see very commonly in greenhouses, but whose life stages, are so tiny, before the adult arrives that it's just really difficult to see them in the first place. So those are I would say the most common pests you would see in the vertical farm.
Great. Thank you for answering that. In terms of, that's very helpful with identifying them, but in your opinion, what is the most effective way to manage these pests in a vertical farm?
Yeah, so there's a lot of strategies that could be employed to really mitigate the pressure imposed by these kinds of pests. The first of which I kind of already alluded to was the installation of air filters. So at entryways, it isn't really possible to do this in a greenhouse so much, but in a vertical farm, you can install these air curtains that again are blowing away the pests. That's number one. When a worker enters a greenhouse facility, and if they happen to come from another facility that might have contamination, it's obviously ideal if they are, changing out of their clothes and into or have some kind of dedicated clothing or footwear for that particular facility to mitigate the entry of, potentially thrips on footwear or on clothing, the hitchhikers that come on clothing, introducing only clean transplant, and even starting BIOS program with transplants before the plants ever get really installed in the vertical farm, mitigating pest persistence through minimizing interplanting and using proper clean out in between. So again, if you're rotating crops on a regular basis out of the vertical farm, making sure that you take a moment to really clean it out properly, so that if you had a pest in the past, you're going to be able to cut the spread of it to the next crop as well. And of course, with that is establishing really solid standard operating procedures for mitigating the movement of either staff, equipment, carts, any equipment for harvesting that might, have those hitchhikers that come onto the new crop. And then finally is tailoring your integrated pest management for different crop types or different growth levels. In a vertical farm, you might have temperature gradients or humidity gradients, and each of these different levels might have a different requirement in terms of, how you mitigate pests in those areas. So knowing what works well for whatever crop you're growing and at whatever level would be really instrumental.
For sure. And it sounds like a lot of the typical food safety protocols would be helpful here as well.
Absolutely, for sure.
Well, in addition to those, are there any other pest management strategies vertical farmers should consider? I know that I've interviewed you before on the use of beneficial insects and other IPM strategies. So I just wanted to get any of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So what's kind of interesting about vertical farms is that there are unique opportunities for pest management. I think we're just at the beginning of understanding or trying to develop. A couple of things that come to mind and things that people have proposed in the past are, integrating new tools like the sterile insect technique where, you've got all your pests contained. And so if you release sterile insects to immediately control the population, that could be a really interesting strategy that's unique to vertical farms and controlled ag. And the other elements, thinking about the use of semiochemicals, mating disruption. We know these strategies work really well in controlled environments. So Indian meal moth, for instance, is a major pest of stored grains, for instance. And one of the greatest mechanisms for controlling it is the use of these semiochemicals that disrupt their ability to mate and reproduce. So, we're just starting to think about these strategies and employing them. They're really effective for managing pests, especially lepidopteran pests. We're just at the beginning of starting to implement such strategies. I think it's really exciting.
Yes, for sure. I think IPM in general for every sector of the CEA industry is super interesting because I feel like there are so many different ways you could tackle it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, Rose, those are all the questions that I really had for you on managing pests in vertical farming environments. But is there anything else that you feel is important to mention?
I guess just that, obviously vertical farms are unique in their IPM needs. There's lots of considerations like just this increased transmission of pests between not only the horizontal plane, but also vertical planes. And so, all of these things, the fact that we're working in a thermocline, a gradient, oftentimes in lighting, it really makes IPM tricky. So, I guess I would just say that in closing, thinking about the tailoring of the IPM program depending on the strata and considering the differences in the transmission of pests are really important to just grasping or developing a solid program for IPM in controlled environments.
Thank you again for taking the time to meet with me this afternoon, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again soon.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Dana.